The United States is the most powerful nation on Earth. Its military, economy, and culture dominate across the planet. Thus, it's hard to imagine 250 years ago, America was a group of British colonies hugging the East Coast. When it did rebel, it only barely won a war that in any reasonable universe the British would have won. So the question to ask is, what if the American Revolution never happened and the US was still a British colony? Before I start, I'm going to say that I will soon make another timeline called What If the American Revolution Failed? These are different timelines. The one you're currently watching is one in which the British and Americans make a deal that allows America to stay in the Empire willingly. The other is one in which the British forcibly defeat the American rebels and force them to stay as part of the Empire. They are timelines that are very different and not to be confused. People often forget that it was many years into the Revolution that anyone but the most radical Americans wanted to secede. For the first 2 years of the Revolution, most Americans were actually loyal British citizens that were rebelling to change the system of power in Britain and get more representation rather than actually secede. Most Americans wanted a compromise that would allow them to share power with Britain or stop being taxed. The Declaration of Independence was so important since it made the quantum shift from "we want better British government" to "we want an independent country." The British could have easily made a compromise at this point to have kept the colonies. The issue was Britain was in no compromising mood. George III, who had an enormous amount of power in Parliament as well as being king, was the last British king who had real power. It was basically an egomaniac who didn't feel like backing down on anything. Also, the British politics of the time period were horribly corrupt, with medieval population numbers being used to represent the modern nation. It's kind of like if America kept the same electoral college points as 1850 today, with the West being completely underrepresented and the Northeast the opposite. Corruption was also rampant, with vote buying and voting laws were out of date, meaning only a very small percentage of the population could vote. Reforming the American system would force the British to admit that the system needed reform, thus destroying the power of those who gained through the corrupt old ways. Thus, for any form of compromise to be created, something awful would have needed to have happened to the British Army early in the war to force them to wake up. I suggest the British take slightly longer to leave Boston in this timeline, and the Americans thus are able to bomb the British fleet by using Dorchester Heights above Boston, thus preventing the British from leaving the city of Boston. Thus, the Americans are able to either starve the British out or wipe them out with superior numbers. Also, keep in mind that for any of this to work, George III would probably have to be a man of great compromise and strategic decision instead of the mildly insane egomaniac he was in our timeline. I suggest the decision that would have worked for both parties is that America remains a crown territory, but have a separate parliament from Britain. Transportation was so awful and America and Britain so far apart that I can't see Americans commuting to British Parliament. Thus a separate American parliament would be created in Philadelphia. This is what Ireland had at the same time period, and what Scotland had before the Union 70 years earlier, so this isn't without question. Americans would also get the rights of British citizens, like the ability to interact with the British train system, but also be taxed. One of the reasons for the American Revolution was that after the enormous native revolt led by Pontiac that was only barely put down, the British were worried about provoking another such war. Thus the British drew a line in the Appalachian Mountains, saying American settlers couldn't settle west of that line. The Americans felt that it was their God-given right to settle the continent, and as British citizens it was their right to take the land from the natives. In this timeline, giving the Americans their own parliament would basically say that the Anglo-Americans were more important than Native Americans, and one of the first decisions of the new parliament would be to revoke this law. Thus we would see the American movement west earlier in this timeline. The British government would not have the same single-minded determination to destroy the native tribes that the Americans had, and would have native allies that they'd already be accountable to. The tribes that would likely benefit from this would be the 7 civilized tribes and the Iroquois. The Iroquois were British allies who inhabited upstate New York and fled into Canada in our timeline after being defeated by the Americans. They would likely survive longer in this timeline, but their warlike nature would mean that at some point they would realize their continent was being conquered and would try to resist the British on some level, which the British would take badly and crush them. Meanwhile, in the southeast, there were what were called the 7 civilized tribes. These were tribes that adapted to European culture and technology more readily than the others. They often had slaves, lived in European-style houses, the Cherokee developed their own alphabet, had their own regiments in the Civil War, etc., and they were thus seen as more civilized by the Europeans. They were almost all British allies, and so would have had some level of immunity. The decision to move these tribes to the west in the Trail of Tears was only made by one vote in Congress in our timeline, and so in this timeline we should expect the 7 civilized tribes to survive in the south. mixing with Southern culture to make a new hybrid, and becoming a minority, something along the lines of the Catholics in our timeline in America. The French Revolution would still have happened in this timeline, but in a very different way. The American Revolution inspired the French Revolution, and the costs of funding the American rebels finally put France into bankruptcy. But the issues that led to the French Revolution still existed, and so some change would have still had to have happened at some point. What people often forget is that in late 18th century France, no one was happy. People often think that it was just the peasants who were angry for their starvation and the intellectuals at the lack of Enlightenment reform that took place in more Protestant nations. Well, in reality, everyone was angry. The king was sad that the rest of Europe, especially England, had continually crushed France militarily, and he was left with enormous debts and a hugely inefficient system. The craftsmen and merchants were angry that they got so little representation in the system, and the nobles were angry that the centralized bureaucratic government left them the playthings of the king. I think that if the American Revolution never gathered together the forces from the lower class intellectual revolution that happened in our timeline, we would have seen the nobles form a parliamentary democracy. This probably wouldn't have been a revolution, but when the crown would go bankrupt and have to turn to the nobles, they would be forced to cut back their power. The nobles were very jealous of Britain's democracy that was more adaptable and also gave more space for the nobles instead of the absolute monarchy of France. We would have seen the French king made accountable to a constitution and a parliamentary board elected by the landowners. This would take over hundreds of years, likely morph into a democracy like what happened in Britain. No revolution means no Napoleonic Wars. This has so many side effects that I'm going to try to power through it so this doesn't become a what if the Napoleonic Wars never happened alternate history. Before I start, I just want to say that even without the Napoleonic Wars, there would still likely be wars between France and the rest of Europe, mainly because it was so common. Across the 18th century, there was an average of a balance of power war involving France every 20 years, and so we could guess this pattern would continue. Firstly, without Napoleon stomping on Prussia for 20 years, Germany would be united earlier. This would mean Germany would be involved in the colonial race earlier and thus would have a better pick of colonies. Secondly, the Spanish Empire would survive. This may sound ridiculous since Spain was such a poor and lightly populated nation that the idea that it would be able to hold together such a massive empire in the industrial age sounds ridiculous. However, Spain was an ally of France, the most powerful nation in Europe, and so France would likely prop up the Spanish Empire far longer than it realistically should have survived, probably until this timeline's version of World War I. Thirdly, this is the one I'm most tentative about. The Dutch Empire would be stronger. During the Napoleonic Wars, when France occupied the Netherlands, the English took the best parts of the Dutch Empire, like South Africa, Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka, and the Straits of Malacca, or modern-day Singapore. However, the Netherlands in our timeline was only barely able to fight off the French, and so a revitalized France, with possibly Napoleon leading it, may have still been able to conquer the Netherlands. Also, there'd be some small changes, like Belgium would remain under Austrian rule for longer, and Venice would survive for longer as well. At some point, a war would have broken out between Britain and France and Spain, as happened 4 times in the 18th century in our timeline. Inevitably, the Anglo-Americans would seize the Louisiana territory from the French by seizing the port of New Orleans with their superior naval power. As the land east of the Mississippi would begin to fill up, there's simply no way the Spanish or French would be able to hold the unsettled Louisiana territory, thus giving the Great Plains to the Anglo-Americans. We would start to see a very confused foreign policy from the Anglo-American regime, and that the American and British parts of the empire would tear in different directions. Britain would be predominant originally, but this would slowly give way to a balance of power, and probably in the 20th century to American predominance. This is shown in that the US surpassed Britain in the 1830s in population and GDP around 1880. This would give British foreign policy a very Hydra-like system in which they would go in their own directions, in which the Americans would want to focus on expansion in North America and eventually in the northern Pacific, which would pit them against the Spanish Empire, an ally of France. Meanwhile, the British would face a colonial and European picture, which they would try to ally with France against Russia, followed by Germany, so you see the complication. Inevitably, the Anglo-Americans would move into the Spanish Southwest. The Spanish didn't have the population pressures to settle their lands in the Southwest, and the Americans did, and so had settled the Southwest even without direct position from the Spanish government. The frontier is so enormous and far from civilization that no legislation could be enforced, and there's no way that the American Parliament would enforce any legislation coming out of Britain on the subject. Hell, the Spanish government might even approve like what happened in Texas with the Mexican government in our timeline, where the Mexicans invited American settlers to help keep down the Comanche tribes. This would mean that it would be politically unadvantageous for Britain to annex the Spanish Southwest. Instead, the settlers would rebel to form their own nations like California, Utah, and Texas, while receiving enormous amounts of aid under the table from the American Parliament. This is basically what happened in Texas and California in our timeline, except that the US annexed both nations. The Spanish Empire, being the elaborate joke it would be at this point, would be unable to defeat the rebels in the same way the Mexicans weren't either. These settler nations would ally with the motherland and create a sort of EU-style trade and military alliance with the British Empire. With separate parliaments, the British Parliament would outlaw slavery at the same time it did in our timeline. Meanwhile, the American Parliament would be slower. The British public, including Queen Victoria, became violently anti-slavery over time. With both the North and Britain demanding the South end slavery, it would happen earlier. The South, with no hope of aid from any European nation that tried to secede, wouldn't. Also, much of the Civil War was caused by the struggle for control of the West and the question of would the West be slave states or free states, which, in this timeline, would be controlled by the Spanish and the Texans. This would mean that the Civil War would not have happened in this timeline. The most hardcore slavers would move to Texas, and slavery would survive in Texas far longer, probably ending around 1880. The Russians sold Alaska to the Americans because they're worried the British would seize it in a future war, and they wanted to get their money's worth from it. But in this timeline, with most of North America being controlled by the British and the US never existing, the Russians would have simply kept Alaska. The Scramble for Africa would have roughly the same outline, but some differences. The Germans would likely get more colonies being united earlier, probably what in our timeline was the Belgian Congo, with Belgium only recently becoming independent, and the reason the Belgians got the region in the first hand was to keep the Germans out of it, and with the Germans being a more established colonial power, they would have taken the region. The Dutch, if they controlled South Africa, would take Bechuanaland and Rhodesia based out of those regions. The Spanish, still being an empire, might also take parts of Africa, like what in our timeline is now called Mauritania. When World War I would roll around, the Spanish, being a French puppet, would side with the Allies, but more importantly, the Americans, being part of the British Empire, would mean that Britain could use America's enormous manpower and industry on the Western Front from the start of the war. The extra strength on the Western Front would mean that the Germans would not be able to win the war in the East, meaning Tsarist Russia would survive, thus meaning that the Communists would never gain power. The extra American forces would also mean that the Germans would not have gotten close to winning the war, and so never would have gotten the stab-in-the-back theory, which held that the Germans lost a war because they were stabbed in the back at the final second. This theory catapulted Hitler and the Nazis into power, until in this timeline the Nazis would never rise to power in Germany. Meanwhile, the Spanish Empire wouldn't be able to handle the pains of World War I. All the major empires that weren't fully industrialized or were multi-ethnic hodgepodges collapsed during World War I, and this would include the Spanish Empire. The forces of nationalism and socialism would tear the Spanish Empire apart. With France fighting for its survival, it would be unable to help its ally, and the Spanish Empire would collapse. Communist regimes would likely arise in the vacuum created by the collapse of the Spanish Empire. Communist revolts tended to work in poorly industrialized regimes, with landowner semi-feudal economies, with peasants at the bottom, and efficient monarchical rule also serves as a good backdrop as well. All of this applies to Latin America in this timeline, and so we should expect communist regimes to develop in this region. I'm going to stop this timeline in the 30s, because I honestly have no idea if World War II would happen or how it would happen, but there's one thing we can be assured of. The British Empire would have survived to the present. This is because the Achilles heel of the British Empire was its lack of whites and industry. The British controlled a quarter of the world and could only really pool men and industry from two small isles in the North Atlantic. Yes, countries like Canada, Australia, South Africa, and India picked up some of the slack later, but it still didn't fix the greater issue. This would not happen in our timeline. The United States would add hundreds of millions of men and enormous amounts of industry to keep the empire going. The British would not be tired from the world wars and would still be the dominant world power today. The French only lost their empire after the British, and were far more militant in keeping their empire. Without the precedent from the collapse of the British Empire, and with World War II possibly not happening, thus not making France tired from the war, France would have survived as an empire, thus meaning colonialism in general would have probably survived far longer. Whatifalthist, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my future videos. Thank you.